so much again for joining us for an important conversation about contracts that exist between vendors and couples during their beautiful wedding planning journey. I feel that in our previous video, we took the view of a couple that was planning their wedding and the mindful points that they need to be considerate about when planning and when engaging with vendors. And in this video, I wanted to specifically reach out to the vendors and, have a look at what the perspective would be for any of the vendors that are engaging with couples, and what are the things that they needed to be mindful of, and what are the important points of consideration before there's a signed contract in place or before a deposit is placed. Okay, so in today's conversation, that I'd like to delve into the world of a business owner who may be an SME or an established provider in the industry, and the importance that contracts have in maintaining a standard and also in protecting themselves. So I think I want to start with the same point that we did in our last conversation. What constitutes a contract? I think in wedding planning, let's be honest, in a wedding, everybody wants to be the wedding planner, from the bride and the groom to the aunt, the mom, the dad, and the friends. And this can be so confusing for vendors. Who do they take their instruction from? And how do we then avoid disappointments for our clients? Because let's be real, everybody in the wedding industry are passionate about what they do. They want to please. They are people pleasers. Absolutely. And so it can be very confusing when you're trying to please 100 people. How do they deal with this?
So I think for a vendor, it would be quite useful for them to have very streamlined methods of communication. And having said this, it's not always easy. So for example, if you are a small business and you prefer telephone or face-to-face communication, and you have a bride and groom that works in a different province or a different country, or works in a business that has an open plan office, that may not always be easy. So they might prefer emails or WhatsApps. And the other thing vendors might also find is that it may get quite time consuming to discuss ideas and reference pictures with a couple before a contract is actually concluded. It would be good for vendors, irrespective of the size, to have a small guideline so they can guide couples as to their best practices. So I'm talking about a very light, easy, either document or a conversation to say, look, this is how we'd work. Send me your reference pictures. I will then send you what I can do. Let's then conclude it. And we need to make sure that you and I have an agreement of what's expected of both of us. Often I know that there's a practice where if a couple send a WhatsApp to a vendor, they get an automated message saying, please confirm your date of your wedding, because if I can't make that date, then it's pointless us getting into the rest of this conversation. I think that's very useful for vendors as well, because for vendors especially, their time is money, and you don't want to spend all this time chatting about an idea with the bride, and at the end she tells you about her wedding date, and then you realize, I'm not even available for that date. And that's time that you cannot bill for to this couple. I think for smaller vendors, very easy agreements. So WhatsApps, SMSs, physical meetings with a couple, that can be part of your negotiations. But once you have your date, time, and what's expected of you, a small document that can also be sent via WhatsApp or SMS is quite important. If that's not suitable, then perhaps on the receipt where you receipt the money received from the couple, at the back of that, you then jot down time, date, this is what I've agreed. That safeguards you as a vendor from any misunderstanding with a couple. On the different end of the scale, if you are a large business and a large corporate venue or a caterer or a photographer, you will then have a more involved contract. I would also recommend that your contract is reviewed from time to time, updated and refreshed. I think that's very important. I've seen contracts through practice that were last updated in 2010 and couples are still using it now. Legislation might have changed. Sometimes the address of the venue may have changed. Road names may have changed. So it would be a good idea for vendors to maybe perhaps just review their contracts every now and then. You don't have to get a lawyer to do this. You can do this yourself, especially if you just make sure that your critical parts of your contract are quite clear, your deposits, your cancellation policies, times, dates, and what's the expectation. If that's reviewed, then your contract should be good to use for the next year.
Kashmir, I must agree. The need for administrative diligence as a business owner is extremely evident. I think being in a creative field, we will always be exposed to new ideas, but it's also equally important that we are updating ourselves with new legislation and also updating things like our contracts. So I absolutely agree with you. I think it also points towards this concept of intention, right?
Yes.
Intention is so important in the wedding planning process. And I think maybe being part-time wedding planner, it's also that, you always ask a couple, well, what is your intention behind having this event? Is it just to get married?
Yes.
Is it to throw a
Yes.
lavish function? Is it to, perhaps explain to our families and our friends who we are as people? So, I think intention is extremely important in that regard. For vendors as well, I think, it allows them to curate ideas very effectively. I think when a lot of vendors start off in their journey, they sort of, want to do everything. And I think we spoke about this at one point. You feel like you really do need the business. And so you're willing to do everything that clients tell you. But certainly over time, you realize that there's an importance to being specific. It cultivates who you are, what you're trying to send out to, what is the message you're certainly trying to send out to your audience. And can you maybe explain the importance of intention from a legal perspective? Is intention important, and how does it affect vendors in the long run?
So we've mentioned this concept before where intention alludes to a meeting of minds. So for example, if I'm a vendor, I understand that my industry, which is the wedding industry, is an incredibly emotional industry. Brides and grooms are often stressed. Moms and dads and siblings are also often stressed out about a wedding, and everyone wants to have an opinion in that as well. It would be a good idea, especially for vendors just starting out, is to have specific boundaries about what I as a vendor can and cannot provide in terms of my service to the couple. It's important to establish that boundary at the outset. For example, if you provide sweet treats and desserts, but you would not set that up at the venue. Under any circumstances, you would not set that up, irrespective of how much money that you're offered, because you simply don't have the means to set it up. Stick to that boundary and make sure that that expectation is set at the outset to the couple itself. And I also think that in terms of intention, it is very important to perhaps write out or have an open discussion with your couple about what they're looking for from the contract and what you can and cannot provide to them as well. I'm saying again, it's a very emotional time for an entire family, so it could be a lot for the vendor to take in as well. Stemming from that as well, it's also important for the vendor to understand who has your contractual capacity in that contract as well. This also ties in with the intention. Often I've used this example as well previously, where a mom and dad will discuss, brainstorm contract on behalf of the couple. The bride flies in from perhaps a job from a different province the week of her function, and then says, I'm not sure why my mom agreed on these colors of ribbons and these flowers and this design for the coconut. I need all of that changed. As a vendor, you need to make sure that in a gentle but assertive way, it is conveyed that you have already outlaid these costs, and to change things at this is what you deem a last minute. To change things at that point is now going to cost the family more money, because you've already undertaken those costs, and now those costs are going to be lost to you. I think clarity is very important with vendors, especially if you are going to be dealing with various different parties throughout the process of that contract.
Oh, and this happens ever so frequently. So I think it is definitely something that vendors need to be, like you say, firm and assertive about, because at the end of the day, you can't be people pleasing everybody at the cost of yourself, right?
Very true.
Okay, I wanted to maybe venture out into this thought. It's that, the wedding industry is very competitive. We're not at a lack of variety or availability of vendors within this industry. And, I think for a vendor who's perhaps starting out or established and has accumulated skills and experience within the industry, you can find that sometimes, your success is being copied through either what it is you make or how it is that you present yourself in social media. How is it that a vendor is able to prevent the copying of ideas or sharing of, for example, secret recipes from maybe an employee that's now left their business and moved to another? How is it that they are able to protect their intellect?
I think, speaking very frankly, it's very difficult to protect your intellectual property on a very casual way. It's difficult to prove and to protect your intellectual property. Also, if this is something that goes as far as litigation, it's not an easy process to follow. It's not very easy to trademark recipes, to trademark looks and ideas, because in the wedding industry, it's a very creative industry. You often find somebody may copy the way you've done your signature turban looks for a groom, and they add maybe 2 more strings of pearls, and then they said, well, it's theirs. It's very difficult for the courts to then go back and see who was the original designer of that turban. It may very well be from a magazine from India, for example. But I think realistically, my recommendation would be for vendors to form their own portfolios. Be careful of source images. This is something that I want to unpack a bit. So when a couple comes to you and says, I want you to do this for me, and this is the picture, and then you do it exactly like that, and turns out you get called out for copying someone when you have no idea where that source picture came from. So I think if vendors are sort of using social media or websites, you can put a small blurb to say, I was given a reference picture by the couple. They asked me to create it exactly like X, Y, and Z. Or if your design is inspired by a brand or by another vendor, give them credit and say, this was inspired by X, Y, and Z. It just makes for best practice. It is really hard to prove and to go the litigation route to show that an idea has been stolen. I've seen on social media often vendors try and sort of trademark their pictures with a small little copyright or a caption or a blurb with their name on it, but that also can be cropped out and your picture can be reused. It is not an easy terrain to navigate, but I think if the best practice starts with you as a vendor to give credit where it's due, I think that you are more or less sort of in safe streams like that.
I absolutely agree. It all does start with you. Kashmir, could you maybe help me understand what contracts do you perhaps or agreements do you get involved in constructing for a typical business? And this question is largely maybe for some of the smaller businesses who don't have these contracts in place and are maybe considering getting them now.
So I think for your very small informal home industry style businesses, we can assist you just with a one-pager guidance on how to contract with parties. So you would not necessarily enter into a 4- or 5-page document with your client, your customer, or the couple, but just a one-pager to say, these are my very basic terms and conditions. And we've previously done this, and I must mention, at the back of an invoice or at the back of a receipt. So these are our terms and conditions. This is our cancellation policy. This is our deposit. One pager like that is sufficient, and you want to have it containing all the essential elements in it. And that's something that we can assist with. Obviously, when it comes to a larger vendor and a higher monetary value item, such as your photography, catering, and your wedding venues, we can assist with your more complicated contracts as well. If you already have a contract in place and you want that revised or refreshed, we can do that annually or biannually as well for vendors.
That's wonderful. I think for all our business owners out there, I encourage you to maybe get in touch with Kashmir or an attorney that's close to you, just so that you're able to get your agreements and your contracts either constructed or at least updated, which is important.